All right, Nancy, I got 1 o'clock Eastern. Is it okay if I go ahead and get this party started officially?
You bet.
All right, awesome. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning if you are out on the West Coast. And if you're watching this as a recording, I hope you're having a good day no matter when and where you are. We are here to talk about the board chair and the ED relationship. Very important topic. I'm excited for this one. I'm also excited that there's so many people joining us live here today. I hope you're all doing okay. I know there's a lot of winter weather going around. I hope you're all staying safe and staying warm, but we're gonna have some fun over the next hour or so. So thanks again for joining us. I'm Steven. I'm over here at Bloomerang, and I'll be moderating today's discussion as always. And just a couple of real quick housekeeping items. Just wanna let you all know that we are recording this presentation. So if you have to leave early, or maybe you get interrupted, or you get another, maybe you're home on a snow day like me and a toddler barges in, don't worry, we will get all that good stuff to you later on today. Just look for an email from me and Bloomerang later on today with all the resources. But most importantly, we love for these sessions to be interactive. So send in your questions, send in your chats. There's a chat box and a Q&A box. If you use the Q&A box for your questions, it might have a little bit more visibility. Just an insider tip there. But we would love to hear from you is the bottom line. Introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't already, and definitely don't be shy about sending your questions, because we're going to save some time at the end. Actually, there'll be a couple of sessions for questions throughout, so we'd love to hear from you. You can also send us a tweet. I'll keep an eye on the Twitter feed as well, but don't be shy, because we'd love to hear from you. If this is your first Bloomerang webinar, welcome. We do these webinars just about every single Thursday throughout the year, usually around 49 or 50 Thursdays, literally. We love doing it. It's one of my favorite things we do here at Bloomerang. But if you've never heard of Bloomerang besides these webinars, we are also a provider of donor management software. That's what Bloomerang is at its core. And if you are interested in that, maybe you're shopping for software here in the near future, check us out, go to our website. Brand new website as of Tuesday, actually. So if you haven't been there in a while, check it out, because it's got a fresh update. But there's all kinds of awesome resources there that you can check out to learn more about us. But don't do that right now. At least wait an hour, because like I said, this is a super important topic, and we're bringing in the big guns. My pal Nancy Manning is joining us from beautiful Austin, Texas. Nancy, how you doing? You doing okay? Staying warm?
I am. I've got kind of a blanket around me. It is very cold in Austin. It's 30 here, which is
right.
Yes.
Which is not normal, right? Well, I'm glad that you're doing this for us. We've been talking about this for a few months. It's finally here. It's a terrible weather day for both of us, but we made it. And dang, I'm really excited for people to learn from you, because if y'all don't know Nancy, she's awesome. She has over 25 years experience in this sector. She's done all kinds of really interesting things throughout her career, including board service, which is probably the most germane to this conversation. Like I said, very active in that nonprofit community down in Austin, but also, and she's going to tell you more about this, but does some really cool classes and meetups and groups through things like Facebook that you're going to want to get plugged into, because she has got a lot of interesting and really lively communities that she runs as well. So you can kind of keep learning from her, which I hope that you will do, because Nancy's awesome, and people don't want to hear from me. They want to hear from you. So Nancy, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll let you bring up your beautiful slides, and then you can tell us all about this fun relationship between the ED and the board chair. Take it away, my friend.
All right. Oops, I'm not where I'm supposed to be. Hold on.
Oh, it took you to the end, didn't it? I hate that.
Yeah. No, Shannon knows. Shannon's here today. Shannon knows that I am, wait a minute, very not good at technology. Hang on. All right. From beginning. Can you see me?
Yes, we can still see you, but I don't think you're sharing your slides yet.
I'm not. And I don't know how to get back to where you guys were. Oh, there you are. Apologize. Let me share screen again. Here we go. Let me try again. There, finally. Yeah.
There you go.
It sometimes takes me a while to get organized, depending on what computer I'm on. So thank you so much, Stephen, for that lovely. That was such a nice introduction. I like that. And welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. for the board chair executive director relationship. I do want to say a few more things about myself that might be relevant to what we're talking about today. As Stephen mentioned, I did practice law for 25 years in Rapid City, South Dakota. And I also owned the only mediation and training center there. So I taught conflict resolution. So, and you can find some of my more interesting career highlights at the link on the screen. I do want to admit shall we say, a less than flattering fact. And that is, during the years I served on nonprofit boards, which I did, I served on 3 nonprofit boards for almost the full 25 years I was there. And you know what? During all that time, I don't remember ever looking up the law that applied to my duties as a board member, in spite of being a lawyer. It wasn't until I moved to Austin, Texas, and began managing nonprofits as an executive director that I did learn about board roles and responsibilities. But you know what? I never really questioned them. Like, how do we know that board members have a fundraising duty that's often described in those roles? And imagine my surprise when I found myself in a bit of a conflict with some board members about that fundraising role. So that whole situation led me down the path of founding my nonprofit consulting company, Power Your Mission, in 2014, and Austin Nonprofit Meetup in 2018. So let's find out what I learned. And Stephen, I think there you go. Thank you. So here's our agenda for today. I'd like to start our conversation today with a look at the ideal relationship between the board chair and the executive director. What does that look like? Then we're going to talk about the more common, less than ideal relationships, as well as the how and why we got ourselves into this mess. We'll look at transforming the less than ideal relationship into the ideal relationship. How might we perform that magic? For that magic, we're going to be looking at some communication tools. Next, we'll learn the tip of the iceberg as it relates to your board's fiduciary duties and what the Francescan friars have to do with it. Finally, we're going to talk about how to call a circle so the boards can learn their fiduciary duties without the leadership staff being thrust into the role of educator. So what does the ideal relationship look like? Well, I use 2 sources to describe this. First is board source, then social capital theory. So let's look at board source. They have that publication called The Source 12 Principles of Governance, the Power of Exceptional Boards. You can find it on board source at that link. And they describe the ideal relationship between the board and chief executive as a constructive partnership. Exceptional boards govern and construct a partnership with the chief executive. They become allies with the chief executive. These are such nice words, right? And they forge a partnership with the chief executive characterized by mutual trust. And I'm going to be talking a lot about that issue. Social capital theory is the second source I use to describe the ideal relationship. That theory generally means the factors that allow social groups, including those within your organizations, to function effectively. Those factors include those bulleted on your screen, and note, trust is listed. Social capital theory explains how relationships can add value to organizations. The relationship between nonprofit boards and leadership staff can either add value to your nonprofit or can weaken or even cause dysfunction within your nonprofit. In 2005, a study was conducted and reported on in the Journal for Nonprofit Management. The article is cited down there at the bottom of the screen. The study used social capital theory to explore whether and how the board chair executive director relationship added value to nonprofit organizations. In this study, the board chair and executive director are referred to as pairs. The study found that there are 3 patterns of work that the board chair and executive director do together. Managing pairs only manage together, like on internal finances or personnel, sometimes developing board agendas, that kind of thing. And then planning pairs engaged in determining direction and strategy, building relationships, working in communities. It was the leading pairs that worked with engaged boards on mission-related and strategic work, and were able to create a level of engagement between their boards and the community not evident in the other pairs. It was the leading pairs that were the most effective pairs in delivering mission impact. Here is why. The board chair executive director study revealed that the strength of trust in the leading pairs was 67% higher than in the planning pairs and 133% higher than in the managing pairs. The study found that the relationship between the board chair and executive director did impact the extent of effectiveness of the organization. Remember, the board source indicated that trust was also a key component of a constructive partnership. The social capital theory study makes clear that it's trust that really makes all the difference. So sadly, by the time I'm hearing about how far south the relationship between the board and leadership staff has gone, both sides feel a lack of trust in the other, whether they acknowledge it or not. In fact, upon closer inspection, I've sometimes found that neither the board chair or executive director can really articulate the issue as one of trust or lack thereof. They're generally mired in details such as complaints by the executive director that the board chair doesn't understand the board's fundraising role, or complaints by the board chair that the executive director doesn't know their place. While there are certainly many nonprofits that enjoy constructive partnerships, unless there are some procedures and guidelines in place, even the best relationships may not survive in that capacity when there's a change in board composition or a transition in staff. Often, the constructive partnership is or has become out of reach for many in the nonprofit sector. So how did we get into this mess? In our sector, we've become used to hearing that the big problem with boards is that they overstep into the management role of staff, or that they are so inactive that they are likely not governing at all. Now, I might be unpopular for saying this, but I think our sector might have done ourselves a bit of a disservice by harping on this distinction between governance and management, because it seems to have created a misunderstanding. Legally, the board of directors of a nonprofit is duty bound, that is by law, to manage their nonprofit. This is clearly stated in most state laws, but it's also clearly stated in the Model Nonprofit Corporation Act, which most states have adopted. Here's an example from the Texas section that's similar to most state laws. And you can just look at the red font where it says the affairs of a corporation are managed by a board of directors. All right, so 1 second. Now, it's important to note that the board can delegate management to paid staff, but it's really important to understand that when the board delegates the duty to manage, that they may not delegate their duty of oversight of management. The language you're seeing, the red font specifically, was adopted from that Model Nonprofit Corporation Act. Just a little sidebar on that. Model acts are developed by the American Bar Association and are then adopted in whole or part by state legislators. Model acts allegedly help clarify and unify laws that have application across all of the United States. So I want to show you the section of the Model Act that our state laws come from, and note that I do leave language on slides like this so you can come back to them when I think the language is worth remembering. The section you're viewing has been adopted, by the way, by 43 states by 2003, so probably more by now. So let's focus on that red font. The activities and affairs of the corporation must be managed by or under the direction and subject to the oversight of its board of directors. And in case they weren't clear, the authors, that's the lawyers who wrote these laws, provided comments to every single section of this act. So look at this. Just in case you didn't understand this, you can delegate this to others, they're telling you, but responsibility to oversee the exercise of that delegated authority nonetheless remains with the board of directors. So legally, it is the board that has the duty to manage the nonprofit, but is allowed to delegate that duty. Once that duty is delegated to the executive director, it's a best practice to allow the executive director to manage and for the board to step away from its management role and stick with its oversight role. Why? Because you either trust the executive director to do their job as a manager or you do not. All right, on this next screen, there's some painful language. I left it up there. It's another one of the comments from the Model Act, but I wanted you to see it. Directors generally have the power to probe into day-to-day management to any depth they choose, but they have the obligation to do so only to the extent that the director's oversight responsibilities may require, or for example, when they become aware of matters that make reliance on management or other persons unwarranted. So reliance on management is going to feel unwarranted to a board if the board has lost trust in management. In a minute, we're going to discuss how to prevent that. But know that if there has been any loss of trust, conflict is going to occur. When I owned Common Ground Mediation and Settlement, I ran a 40-hour program to train people to become mediators. And a significant part of that training involved teaching about conflict and conflict resolution. There was a slide that I used in those days, and I found it. I want to share it with you. It's called the Conflict Continuum. We're just going to talk about the first three. Denial is sometimes a natural defensive posture that allows you time to adjust to what's happening. Then you move into avoidance sometimes. Many of us have difficulty with confronting conflict. There may be fear that the relationship will end. There's a desire to take the easy road by ignoring the problem and hoping it's going to go away. Avoidance often results in a breakdown of communication or indirect or even dishonest communication. And folks, this is where I find most executive directors and board chairs, by the time I hear about these issues, in that avoidance stage. Problem solving is where we want to be. This is a collaborative style of conflict resolution that involves talking, listening, working together, and cooperating. Unless you are in the problem solving area of this continuum, you most likely have a dysfunctional relationship. So how do you get there? How do you get to the problem solving part of that continuum when, for instance, your job could be at stake if you're the executive director, for instance? First, you must be honest with yourself about being outside the problem solving part of the continuum and understand that fault never or rarely lies with one party to a conflict. It is true that there are nonprofits that are not learning nonprofits. Everyone in the organization may feel they know it all, board member and staff alike, and that's going to be damaging to the nonprofit. Sadly, avoidance of conflict means that conflict will eventually escalate. So how do you prevent conflict that's rooted in a loss of trust? Or how do you rebuild trust that's been lessened or lost? Here comes the magic. The only way to prevent a loss of trust or to build trust that's been lost is through a process of intentional communication that I've provided to you as downloads on my website. There are two communication templates. We're going to talk about this one, communication strategy for board chair, executive director check-in. The executive director and board chair do need to establish consistent check-in times 1 to 2 times per month, and you should never put this on the back burner no matter what, even if you feel you've got the greatest relationship today. If you're an executive director and aren't comfortable suggesting these check-ins to your chair, but you have a board buddy, you may want to start the conversation with your board buddy by asking that person to help you set up your first and maybe second meeting between the board chair and executive director. The first few meetings between the board chair and executive director will follow the steps I've set out for you in your first handout, this one on your screen. For this to work, you really do need to commit to these check-ins at least 1 time a month, but ideally I suggest you shoot for twice a month. And also don't put it on the back burner because you're too busy, because you're always going to be too busy. Sorry about the noise there. So let's go over some of these strategies, or at least the first one. The first strategy is to establish the check-ins. You want to establish guidelines for your check-ins. Now, guidelines might include whether you'll cover specific topics at each meeting, whether you're going to follow a similar agenda, that kind of thing. But listen, establishing guidelines is listed as your first task topic. If there's any conflict, avoid it or not. This will begin the process of establishing a bit of a comfort level. The next part is to invite discussion of issues and challenges. For instance, you might want to establish what constitutes a surprise that should be shared with the board chair before it's shared with the full board. And I'm going to give you one of my painful examples. I was the executive director of a nonprofit theater at one point, and I was sharing my monthly executive director and fundraising report to the full board. And we had a donation of $25,000 from one of our actual regular larger donors. And so I put that in with everything else like usual. And I could tell my board chair was getting a little annoyed. And when we were all done, he expressed his anger with me for not sharing that donation with him before I shared it with the full board. Well, I thought to myself, yeah, I'm not a mind reader. How did I know that that was going to be a surprise to him? Well, had I done what I'm teaching you to do, set up these guidelines and find out in advance, I could have said to that chairperson when I was setting up the guidelines, what might you want to hear before I share it with the full board, right? If you're afraid to do that, these issues are going to catch you by surprise. You'll need to ask when you're working on guidelines how to address the most difficult issues, making sure there's a safe way to do this. When you set up these check-ins, you also want to make sure you have permission to share bad news. And I have another story about that, and this is a different nonprofit. I was executive director, and we had some kind of major problems with the database we were using. And I discovered the problems, and I was in process of fixing them. And I shared that with the board. Well, oh my gosh, I thought I dropped a bomb. So again, had I followed my own advice and checked with my board chair in advance, shared what's bad news and can I share it, and should I share it with you first, I could have avoided all of that probably. If you do this, the board chair is going to come to deeply appreciate the respect provided by the executive director by following that very simple guideline. And of course, you always want to take time to include the positive. Share what is going well if you're not with your work. The remainder of the strategies in this handout will guide you through some communication skills. Just want to say a few things about communication in general. Every relationship you have in your life involves some communication issues. None of us are perfect communicators. Years ago, I conducted a communications workshop on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota at a K-12 school for 150 staff members. We did this activity where two people were facing each other, standing in front of the group. We had them engage in a dialogue about an important issue, but before starting the dialogue, we chose people to stand behind each of the two people. They were silent, but they represented other people in the lives of those two people, like the parents, the grandparents, and others who have had an impact on the two people engaged in the current dialogue. This was designed as a visual. This activity was designed as a visual to demonstrate the baggage we often bring into any relationship as we attempt to navigate a current relationship, like between the board chair and executive director. The other primary issue hampering communication is the ability to listen deeply to a person who is speaking to you. That ability is often impaired by how I might feel about the person or what we're thinking we'll say in response to the person speaking, rather than being present in the conversation. When we talk about calling a circle towards the end, you're going to discover the magic of being present in conversation. These are basic communication issues. Our baggage, our ability to listen, that impact our relationships and our working environment, and hopefully the strategies I've provided in that download will help you to attend to these issues when the board chair and executive director participate in your check-ins. There is a second set of communication guidelines I've provided that will aid communication between the full board and staff. And I'm just going to read this real quick. And it's the other download on my site there. The guidelines acknowledge the difference between governance and management and how those roles should be respected, but also make clear that nothing in the guidelines are meant to hinder the board chair and executive director from working together on managing, planning, and leading the organization when the relationship is characterized by a high degree of trust. And then also, if you'd like some help with setting up your regular check-ins or with any communication issue, you can book a free strategy session with me. You and your board chair, you and your board buddy can come to this free strategy session. You just go to the contact us and book that. Now, there's 2 other sections I'm going to cover. But before we do that, I want to find out if anybody has any questions. And Steve, what do I do here? Do I stop my?
Well, no, I think you can leave on that slide. I've got a couple questions here that have come up in your recent comments. There's one here from Mark. I think it came up when you were telling that story about the database. Mark's wondering, does everything need to be communicated to the board chair before it's shared with the entire board? Or is there exceptions to that? Or is it a good rule of thumb to always go to the board chair first? What do you think?
Okay, no, you certainly don't have to do that. That would be a little bit cumbersome. But that's why when you're setting up your guidelines with your board chair, you find out what's important to that board chair to be shared separately first. Take your cues from that board chair. But otherwise, yeah, you'll have a lot to share every month. It's just your basic stuff. You may also want to talk to your board chair when you're setting up those guidelines. What does that board chair want you to share every single month? And you hopefully have a comfort level where you can suggest what should be shared every month. Does that help?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Hopefully that was received well for Mark too. Here's another interesting one, Nancy. I think this is coming from an ED, didn't necessarily say in the question, but they're asking that the board chair wants to coach them, but they don't feel that is their role necessarily. What do you think about that, Nancy? Do you think it's appropriate for the board chair to kind of take on a coaching / mentor role with the ED or maybe other members of the staff?
It depends on what they're talking about in terms of coaching. I can think of a situation where it might be relevant, and I can think of situations where it would be considered micromanaging, and you don't want that. So let me think of something where it might be relevant. Let's say you have a brand new executive director, and they need to be coached on something within what I call the 5 focus areas of nonprofits: programs, operations, research development / fundraising, people, which is your board, staff, volunteers, or communications. So it would depend on the experience level in each one of those 5 areas, whether it's appropriate for the board and what their skill level is for coaching. So in other words, one of my favorite answers as a lawyer, when I used to teach criminal justice courses, where somebody would ask me a question, the answer would be, it depends. And it's the same answer here. It depends on what they're trying to coach you on, whether it's appropriate or not.
Cool, makes sense. There's quite a few questions, Nancy. Maybe I'll do one more because I know you got a lot of good stuff for us. But here's one from Crystal. If you have co-chairs, should the check-ins be with both co-chairs at all times, or is it okay to meet with them separately? I'm also kind of curious on your opinion on having co-chairs to begin with, Nancy. What do you think?
I think co-chairs are weird. Yeah, in fact, I know one organization whose court co-chair was the executive director, and that got to be a mess because I don't think they understood the ex officio role. But anyway, preferably, I guess you would have the meetings with both co-chairs, but that's not always practical. I would hope that when you're setting up the guidelines, that first of all, that would be with both co-chairs. Then you could rotate, but you'd have to have an agreement when you're setting up those guidelines that whoever the co-chair is that's participated in that check-in, that they'll share with the other chair if need be. I think that's the only way you could deal with what could potentially work into a mess.
That makes sense. Yeah, we feel for you, Crystal. That can be a weird situation, but hopefully that helps. Well, there's a lot of good questions, but why don't we keep going, Nancy, and I'll flag the rest of them for later.
All right. So, yeah, and also we will have time for questions at the end. So remember at the beginning, I asked how and why we got ourselves into this mess that often exists in our sector. We spoke about that management versus governance issue, but now let's dive just a bit deeper to discuss the problems that arise when boards don't fully understand governance, which must be exercised based upon their legal fiduciary duties. Often staff find themselves thrust into the role of explaining those duties that frankly they often don't fully understand either. This very frequently arises when an executive director attempts to explain to the board that they have a fundraising role. So let's hear what the American Law Institute has said to get us started. The American Law Institute says that volunteer nonprofit boards are often much less knowledgeable about their responsibilities than their paid for-profit counterparts. You know what? There's a really good reason for this. There's a good reason that few people, including staff in the nonprofit sector, don't have a good understanding of fiduciary duties. As a lawyer, I became very interested in discovering why were we telling boards that they had a fundraising role. My research took me through literally 3,000 years of history and about 700 years of law. I'm going to share just a tiny tidbit of the history of fiduciary duties that will hopefully interest you enough to watch a video I created on fiduciary duties, and I do have a link to that later on. But why should you even learn this? Well, here's the example I want to use. When I was executive director at Travis Audubon, I walked into that job knowing nothing about birds other than some of them are pretty, but I didn't know anything really. And the longer I was there, and I went on some field trips and took some of the classes, I began to learn things like field cues that would help you identify birds. I learned what some birds eat and why the northern mockingbird wasn't eating out of my bird feeder. I learned that kind of stuff. I learned what part of the tree that they are, the ground, In other words, I began to really appreciate birds and learned all about what they did for the environment. So it's my belief that if boards and staff were more interested in learning about fiduciary duties, they'd come to understand, respect, and appreciate them, which will then reduce conflict and produce a much more effective nonprofit. So I want to give you just the super teensy tidbit of the history, hopefully to wet your whistle. And as I said, fiduciary duties, the first mention, literally goes back to before 1700 BC. I'm going to skip about 1500 years to a legal concept called the use and the Franciscan friars. So the Franciscans were founded by St. Francis in 1209 AD. The friars could not own property, so they conveyed land to individuals to hold the land for the use of the friar. At the same time this was happening, there were English feudal laws that didn't permit anyone except the legitimate firstborn son to inherit his parents' estate. The law of uses allowed landowners to circumvent these feudal laws to leave land and funds to other than firstborn sons, including to the needy. Now, the charitable trust, which is where our nonprofits come from, developed from the history and law of uses. So let's take a second to look exactly at what a fiduciary is. And it should look exactly the same as that language we just looked at. Someone acting on behalf of another based on the expectation of trust. It makes sense. If you're a friar and you want the person you're allowed to hold your land and use for you to be someone you trust. Even so, there were abuses of this trust. So courts began imposing duties on those holding property for another. What you need to know is that the laws by which your nonprofit board is compelled to operate are based on the fiduciary duties that evolved from the law of uses. You're often going to hear and see them like this: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. The weird thing is the language in your state laws isn't going to look like this, which is going to confuse anybody that actually bothers looking up their state law. State laws on this are called something like standards of conduct for board of directors, for instance. You're going to see language that actually comes from that model act that I showed you, all right? But remember all those comments in the model act? All those authors of those laws that you're looking at in your state make clear that it's still all based on these basic fiduciary duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. How are board members supposed to learn these duties, though? Most experts seem to indicate that leadership staff should be teaching them. And I'm going to say, I think that's a bad idea, frankly. Keep in mind that the board is in the legal position of boss to the executive director and should be because of their legal duty of oversight. In my 30 years of involvement in the nonprofit world as both a board member and executive director, I can attest to boards often becoming defensive when being educated by their staff. Add to this the fact that most leadership staff don't really have a great understanding of fiduciary duties either. So what should we do? Well, I've got 3 easy steps. The first is going to be to watch the video. Second is called a learning circle. And 3 is rotate discussing one role and responsibility at each board meeting. Let's take these one at a time. So step 1 is to learn about fiduciary duties by watching the video on fiduciary duties that I hope I've made really interesting. Make sure that leadership staff and board watch this video. If you're uncomfortable asking board members to watch the video, ask your board buddy to watch and ask him or her to suggest it to the board. I have one technology tip about this video. The link is right there on your screen. This was a live video I did for my group, so the sound quality is reflective of the fact that I have tile floors in my office. So you might fare better with headphones and reading the closed captions. Just a little tip there. So watch the video, then you're going to learn to call a circle. You may notice on my website on the About Us Career Highlights page that I spent about 25 years working with Native American populations in South Dakota, and we literally use circles for everything, from federal criminal sentencing circles to building communities. I've even heard of a software developer that uses circle work to develop software and claims it cuts the production time by half. I have a 12-minute video on my YouTube channel called Calling a Circle. It will teach you how to call a circle and what you're going to need in terms of supplies and guidelines. What I want you to know and believe is that there is magic in circles. Why should we call circles in our nonprofits? Most often, when we're in conversation with others, we don't pay complete attention. We don't listen deeply because we're thinking about what we'll say in response. But there is something about the circle and use of the talking piece that prevents your mind from wandering. And don't ask me how that magic works. But every time I've ever been in a circle, it works. My mind does not wander. I'm present. One of the beauties of working in circles that makes them most relevant for nonprofits is the key elements. The first is rotating or shared leadership. Every person helps the circle function by assuming small increments of leadership that carry out the group's defined purpose. Rotating leadership doesn't mean the group is leaderless. It means the leadership passes among group members. The circle minimizes distinctions between teacher and learner or boss and employee. Using a circle to learn about governance issues prevents the whole dynamic of leadership staff teaching boards. Next is shared responsibility. Each person works to sustain a respectful environment. We pay attention by being aware of what we and other people need in terms of support. We think before speaking, and the guidelines and talking piece allow you to do that. And then finally is reliance on spirit. Each person places ultimate authority in the center and takes their place at the rim. The center becomes a symbolic place where everyone's willingness to listen dwells. You can call the center a sacred space, the heartbeat of the group, or the group process. You're going to learn more about all of this when you watch that video. Step 3. If you don't talk about fiduciary duties, your board will not take them seriously. Because of the complexity of the law related to fiduciary duties, in the 1980s, fiduciary duties were translated into the now famous 10 board roles and responsibilities that you can find on the Board Source website. These roles and responsibilities were developed so the boards could more easily conform their conduct to law. Now, at the end of the Fiduciary Duties video, I have invited you to watch. There's an exercise mentioned to help you learn to apply the proper fiduciary duty to the corresponding role and responsibility. Let me see here. Okay. I just wanted you to see that if you go to the free stuff part of my website, see where it says board roles and responsibilities? I made my own. There's 7 of them instead of 10. And the reason why mine is so different, I included a preamble about the fiduciary duties. Now that's going to help you match which fiduciary duties go with which board role and responsibility. So step 3 is my suggestion that once you learn about fiduciary duties and you have called a circle, you ask each board member to pick one of the roles of board members and share about that role. What have they learned? What does it mean to them? It's my belief that if you do this at every board meeting, taking one role and sharing it for even 10 minutes, your board would develop into a more legally compliant and effective board. All right, so that brings me really to the end, but I want to give you some more resources. So there's my email and my website. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I think is my unique Facebook group. And then there's the link to my YouTube channel. So look, this is where the action happens. I'm a member of about 15 nonprofit Facebook groups, and I think I'm the only one that offers a monthly topic. So for instance, this month in February is Nonprofit Leadership Month. We've done every topic in those 5 focus areas we talked about, tons of them on specific fundraising issues. We've done operations, we've done volunteer stuff. Every month is a new topic. And then 1 time a month, we do our meetups. That's always on the 3rd Thursday. And it's on that same topic. And we have a variety of formats we use to keep it really lively. Some months I'm the only presenter. Some months there's co-presenters. Some months there are a panel of speakers, all experts, and some months we even do networking. Then the other thing that happens in that group is 2 to 3 Tuesdays of every month, we do 15-minute live interviews of experts on that same topic. I'd very much love to have you join us. There's a live link at the bottom of that screen. And I will note that we are still called Boston Nonprofit Meetup, even though we are nationwide. And on my YouTube channel, I just want to point you to when you click on playlists, because I had to learn this recently. I didn't realize this is how it worked. So under each one of these playlists, you have to click on the playlist, view full playlist. So to find those videos that I invited you to specifically watch, click on the Nonprofit Board of Directors playlist where it says view full playlist to find that video on fiduciary duties. And the Calling a Circle video is in the playlist called Online Course Examples playlist. You can also find some of the Facebook Live interviews and the meetups if you want to see what we're doing. And then finally, one of the keys to having a board that is able and willing to work as a constructive partner with the Chief Executive Officer is finding board members with some specific leadership competencies. You're going to learn how to find them and recruit them with this little $42 package I've got called 4 Steps to Recruiting Your Best Board Members. All right, folks, that is it. And we've got time, I think, right, Steve, for some more questions?
Oh, yeah, we got plenty of time for questions and plenty of questions. I really appreciate everyone who's chimed in with their questions. I always appreciate the interactivity. But Nancy, first of all, thanks. That was really awesome. I learned a lot. Big takeaways for me are mutual respect, open communication. Can't really go wrong if that's the foundation of the relationship, right? If you haven't asked a question, do so now, because probably got a good solid maybe 10 or 12 minutes, and I'll try to get to all of them. I promise I'm not playing favorites here. Recent one from Chris here, Nancy, came up when you were talking about the concept of a circle, which I thought was really cool, by the way. how can you do that online in a virtual setting? And
Um,
and even more broadly, all of this, I would imagine, is happening virtual these days. How do you overcome that when you can't be in person in a lot of cases?
Okay, so I don't know if she's still here, Cynthia Herrera from Ashwell. Are you still here? The reason I ask is because Cynthia had some ideas about that. I'm trying to remember what the idea was. There's supposed to be something that you can do in Zoom. For instance, somehow, when you see my Calling a Circle video, you're going to see the small table I use. I actually had it made specifically to call a circle, and you'll see the picture of that type of table. And so somehow, if you could get that into the middle space of your Zoom, and I'm not sure how to make that work. And then you'd also have to have maybe a hand raised for the talking piece. Oh, Cynthia is writing me a message. Wait a minute.
She's saying spotlight. Is
Yes,
that?
she is. It's called Spotlight on Zoom. Yes, I've never used it, but somebody should try that after watching the video to see if you can make it work. I think that'd be a lovely idea.
Here's one. Here's an anonymous question, and I think I understand why. Can you talk a little bit about the generation gap, Nancy? Maybe you have an older board chair and a younger ED, and maybe there's some miscommunications just due to the age gap, or perhaps the younger ED feels like they're not being perhaps respected because there isn't that decades of experience there. Have you seen that, or maybe overcome that? Yeah.
I've seen it both directions. I've seen
Sure,
it
sure.
the older board chair, younger ED, and younger board chair and older. It's really actually the same issue. It is communication. It is respect. It is trust. It's getting to know one another to raise that trust level. And I honestly believe the only way you can do that is by doing that. You have to be intentional. You have to be intentional. Otherwise, you're just avoiding that issue. You're avoiding the conflict. And so if you have another board buddy that maybe is closer to your age, maybe engage that person. Or you can always do a free strategy session with me so I can help you figure out some ways to get that working. It is tough, but it's all based on the same issues of communication, open, honest communication. You have to build the respect, you have to build the trust. It's the only way to do it.
Makes sense. And it works both ways, like you said.
Yes.
Here's one from JC. JC is a formerly uninformed board member, now informed, also has a legal background. And JC is wondering, how do you broach the subject with the board when they've kind of relied on that one person on the board who is the legal expert? That happens, right? It's like, oh, we got the lawyer on the board. We'll just run everything by them. But broadly, the rest of the board doesn't really know what's going on in terms of governance. How do you kind of maybe take that off the shoulders of that legal expert and inform the rest of the board that, hey, they are an officer of or a responsible party of the organization?
Okay, so wait, is the legal person we're talking about on the board as the legal person on the board?
Yes, I
Okay.
believe so.
When I was in law school, we had a course called interviewing clients. So I can't remember. And I remember one of the things that we learned is being able to say, I don't know. The answer is, I don't know. So in other words, it's very hard for a lawyer to do that. Lawyers have a hard time saying, that's not something I know. It's not my area. Hey, let's do this. I would love to learn that. Let's find out how we can learn that. You got to be straight up honest about it sometimes.
Here's an interesting one. And I'm also kind of curious, Nancy, on your thoughts of kind of term limits or length of service here. The question specifically is, when the board chair is changing every year, how do you, get that person up to speed, build the trust. Should it change every year? Is that a normal schedule? And I'm asking just as someone that doesn't know, honestly, is 1 year, 3 years appropriate for a board chair? And if it's shorter, how do you get that person up and running as fast as possible and as done as well as possible?
Okay, well, first of all, the short answer is a good solid board orientation. And it has to be really effective. I've got the little orientation package on my website. You can look at, there's a guidance document right on there. Okay, so that's the short answer. The longer answer is there is a variety of opinions about term limits. Sean, my buddy, Sean Kostovsky, I think I've heard him say term, what did he says sort of a different thing about term limits, about it might not be so bad that they're there longer. And I think what he's saying is you want to keep the good ones, but 1 year is probably not long enough. 3 years is more normal. I have been on boards that were serving 35 years and it was not pretty. So it's what's healthy. How effective are your board members? Are they willing to learn? And again, in that board recruitment package, I really harp on leadership competency. When you're looking for board members, we tend to stop after skill set. We need the lawyer, we need the marketer, all right? My theory is that that's a mistake. We need to look at leadership competencies. So in my package, I have a handout on what are leadership competencies. You absolutely need to be an effective board member. So that's the two things. One, when you're recruiting, make sure you get people with leadership competencies, and two, solid orientation.
I love that. The orientation is so important. Along the same lines, this is a good question from Terry, kind of dovetails into it. Do you think it's appropriate to have an incoming chair kind of shadow the outgoing chair? Or in other words, is there like an overlap period where they can kind of see the outgoing chair in action? Or is it a good way to maybe get those two, the outgoing and the incoming person, together before the transition, formally takes place? What do you think of that?
Great question, because this month's meetup is on board chairs being unprepared. My speaker is Mike Burns, who was part of a survey. They interviewed 635 nonprofit leaders and discovered that most board chairs feel very unprepared. So one of the ways, of course, is mentoring. You have a succession plan in place for both your leadership staff and your board. There should always be that mentoring. One of the problems is when the chair doesn't really understand governance. So then you're back to those basics again, making sure your orientation, willingness to learn is part of your orientation.
Makes sense. Here's an interesting one. Founders. We've been talking a lot about EDs, but what about when the ED is also a founder and they can maybe have a little bit more feelings of maybe ownership or strong ties to the organization? Any differences in what you've been saying when Nancy, the ED, is also a founder?
No.
Okay.
The thing is, the whole issue with founders, in fact, I've got a speaker this month in my Facebook group who's a founder, board member, and something else. I can't remember. Oh, and the executive director. And so the title of her guest interview is multiple leadership hats or something. And she's going to address some of this, but it's a very hard role to be in, and sometimes they get entrenched in doing it a certain way. Again, it comes back to leadership competencies for that person. And part of my handout talks about personal leadership competencies. That's the desire to always learn and grow. That will save almost any issue. If you're willing to learn and grow, and you have good judgment, and you're a problem solver, that's going to go far. Even if you're the founder, and even if you're the founder that's been there forever, or you're a founder and just getting started.
I love it. There's a lot of really good questions here, Nancy. No way we'll get to all of them. Would you mind clicking back one slide, I think, Nancy, to your contact info? Because I want people to be able to get, I can't remember if that was forward or backwards one slide, but I know you had a nice slide. There it is. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. Thanks, Nancy. Here's one from Kim, and curious your opinion on kind of the premise of the question too. Kim wants the board members to be in the service area of the nonprofit. It sounds like they're a library, so want them to live in that town the library serves, but having a hard time finding good board members in sort of that geographic radius. One, makes sense to me they would want local folks, but if so, how do you find people? What are sort of your tips for that kind of board acquisition or board recruitment?
Okay, well, it's in my package for $42, but I'll give you a few hints. You always start with my board matrix. Start with mine because mine has the leadership competencies in it. You look at your current board and it's anonymous. In other words, each board member self-evaluates you, and when you're all done checking off all the qualities, skills, resources, everything on that board matrix, you're going to find your gaps. So that's the first thing, is you got to figure out what you're looking for. The next part is, okay, where do I find those people? And again, in my recruitment package, I have a list of ways to find board members. And Board Source also has a nationwide, what's it called, regional board member list that you can find people allegedly in your local area. But you'll find what you'll need in that package about where to find them, and then what you do to recruit them. The marketing materials you will need are in that package. How do you interview those people? And also included in there is Board Source's yearly survey results about board members are most frustrated with the fact that they weren't provided accurate and honest expectations. All of that is in my package.
That Board Source survey is really cool. I look forward to that one every year. So thanks for connecting people to that. Probably have time for one more question. I promise I'm not playing favorites because there's a lot in here, and I hope you all will reach out to Nancy and check out those meetups if you can. What about meeting frequency? Pretty brass tacks question from Sean. Sean's having monthly meetings with the ED or with the executive board members. Should they also have a one-on-one monthly meeting with the board chair in addition to that meeting? What's a good kind of meeting cadence for the ED and the board chair and maybe even the rest of the board? What do you think?
Yes. First of all, the frequency of your board meetings in general that the executive director attends, that can be anywhere from once a month to once a quarter. I always think it's better to do it once a month, but it depends on your nonprofit. But no matter what, you should still be doing that meeting with the board chair at least once a month. And depending on the nature of your relationship, you may even want to bump it to twice a month if you're in a discomfort level with that board chair, so that you can begin to feel more comfortable. All right, but at least once a month with just the board chair.
Makes sense. Maybe it'll be easier to meet twice a month, like you said, if you can do it virtually, but actually work to your advantage.
Yes.
Well, Nancy, you've been so kind with your time and your expertise. I want to give you the last word since we got a couple minutes left. We got your contact info on the screen, but what's the best way for people to connect with you afterwards?
Does my email up there? Yeah, my email is probably the best way to contact Nancy@poweryourmission.com. And you know what? Join that Facebook. I'm telling you, that's where the action is. I'll send them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We will get you the slides in the recording, and you'll be able to click into all the stuff that she mentioned, the videos, some of those other job description templates you mentioned, and all this good stuff here. Nancy, this was a lot of fun. I'm glad that the power didn't go out for both of us and we could actually make this happen.
Really? Thank you so much for everybody who attended as well.
Yeah, thanks to all of you for hanging out. I know it's a busy time of year. You got a lot going on and took an hour out of your day, which I always appreciate. And if you've got another hour to spare, next week, we're going to be talking corporate sponsorships. My pal Mazarine, she's a good friend of the program. She's going to be talking about what sponsors really want from nonprofits. And she knows. She has run nonprofits. She has also run events that I've sponsored, and I think she's really good at communicating value to sponsors. So that's going to be a really good presentation. 1 week from today, same time, same place, 1 Eastern. We're going to record it. So if you can't make it, register anyway, because you'll get the recording and you won't take anyone's spot. We won't even know that you weren't here necessarily. So feel free to do that. Of course, if you can join us live, we would love to see you live. So we will call it a day there. Hopefully you see us next week. Like I said, look for an email with the slides and the recording, all the good stuff that Nancy was putting out there. And hopefully we will see you again on our next webinar. So have a good rest of your Thursday. Have a good week and a good weekend, I should say. Stay safe, stay warm. We need all of you out there doing awesome things for the world. So take care, and hopefully we'll see you again next week. Bye now.
Thank you, Steve.
See ya.